To understand the history of Japan and the culture of the Japanese people, one of the most important things to look at is their early creation myth. The ideas in this story will help to explain Japan's view of their position in the world, their geography, natural disasters, the importance of tradition and culture. It will even help you to understand things like why their flag looks the way it does and how Japan could have ended up having a feudal society despite the fact that they had an emperor, and how that emperor is going to become a mere figurehead for a period of time, and why that figurehead was still so important to the people. So I'm going to summarize a more modern retelling of the creation story, one that was published in the 700s. Just because it's easier to understand. And I'll just give you a couple of the highlights, just enough so you can kind of see what the big important takeaways are. And you will notice some things that you may have learned about before. Like when Izanami goes into the underworld, it might remind you about Orpheus's quest in Hades. You might also be reminded of like the Sumerian myth with the descent of Inanna into the underworld. So some of this may sound pretty familiar to you, but a lot of it will also be quite unique. So with the creation myth, according to the Shinto religion, back before everything existed, what did exist was this unimaginably limitless, shapeless form. After eons like this, something light and transparent will rise up and form heaven. From here, in the plane of heaven, the three divine beings will also be born, these three creating deities. Meanwhile, what was heavy and opaque in this void would gradually form what is the earth. But it took a really long time before it condensed sufficiently to form solid ground. So you look at it in the earliest stages, for millions of years, the earth is said to have resembled like a floating, like almost like oil on the top of the surface of water. And because of this separation of the heaven and the earth beginning to form, the heavens are going to allow this light to come through. And as a result, suddenly, like the sprouting up of a reed, a pair of immortals will be born. From these immortals, they produced many other immortals, and many pairs were born. And from those other pairs, and these gods, though, because the world was existing in chaos, they didn't really have anything to do. So in response to not having something to do, two important deities were summoned to be divine beings. They were Izanagi and Izanami, and they were told to descend to this nebulous place that will become Earth and form the first solid ground. To form this solid ground, Izanagi and Izanami were given a precious spear with costly gems on the end. So after a ceremony where they were presented this spear, they went down to this bridge connecting the heavens to this nebulous mass. And to be honest, they had no idea what to do with this spear once they got it there. So they stood there pondering it until Izanagi decided to, well, let's just try it out and see what happens if I stir up some of the brine with the end of the spear. When he pushed the spear down, he noticed it hit something, and when he lifted the spear, these drops fell off and formed the first island, the island of Onokoro. Izanagi and Izanami were delighted with what they had discovered here. Two birds landed, and they watched the bird, and they decided that they wanted to get married. And they wanted to do this before finishing their task of creating a country. But when Izanagi and Izanami went to get married, what they did was they erected a pillar in the center of the island. And around that pillar, they built a great palace called the Hall of 8 Fathoms. And for the marriage ceremony, they would go around this enormous pillar that they had, and the male would walk around one way, the female would walk around the other. So Izanagi would walk around one way, Izanami the other. And when they met at the other side, they would speak to each other and thus be wed. It's important to note here that when they got to the other side, it was Izanami, the female deity, that spoke first, not Izanagi. And she said, How delightful it is to meet so handsome a youth. Izanagi replied, How delightful I am to have fallen in with such a lovely maiden. After they spoke these words, Izanagi did tell Izanami that he was supposed to have spoken first, but they went ahead and consummated their marriage. And after which, Izanami gave birth first to a child that had no bones, and they thought that the deities in heaven would not want them to raise this child, so they set it off to sea in like a reed boat. And then they gave the birth to another child that they were also equally unhappy with. So they returned to the heavens and they said, What went wrong? Why are you unhappy with us? We're doing what we've been instructed to do. And they were told that they did the ceremony incorrectly. And that's an important point. They did it wrong, that Izanagi was right. He was to have spoken first. So they knew what they needed to do. They went back down to where they had erected this pillar, and they re-performed the marriage ceremony. They said the same words, but this time Izanagi spoke first, and Izanami spoke last. And after that, the rest of their children left nothing to be desired. Izanami gave birth to the main islands of Japan. She gave birth to the numerous smaller islands. They also gave birth to a variety of deities who would inhabit these islands and the seas. They had deities to explain the wind, the trees, the mountains, the weather, the sea, everything. So up to that point, everything was going well until Izanami gave birth to a fire deity. She was burned so badly during this process of giving birth to a fire deity that she died. Izanagi was so upset that he did everything he could to resuscitate her and succeeded in restoring her consciousness. She could no longer eat, and he tried to cook all kinds of things, the tastiest stuff he could come up with to get her to eat, but whenever she swallowed something, she immediately rejected it, and in her rejecting it, she would be giving birth to other types of deities, including the god and goddess of metal, and the god and goddess of earth. This would mark the introduction to death into their world. Izanami would have been the first to die and go to the underworld. Izanagi was so upset and distressed at his loss that he started to cry, and his tears gave birth to other deities. But in his grief, he became so mad at the fire deity that he chopped him up into pieces, each one of the limbs that he chopped off becoming another deity. Meanwhile, Izanami would travel to the land of Yomi, which is similar to what you might think of as the land of Hades. So Izanagi travels to the land of Yomi to try to find Izanami. He searched for her in the darkness and was calling for her, and she called back that he had come too late. She had already eaten of the food of the underworld and thus could not go back. But just the same, Izanami said that she would go and seek out the gods of the underworld and ask for permission to go with Izanagi. She told him, though, that while she did this, he must not look for her. He must not look at her. Izanagi, while waiting, grew impatient and decided to go and look for her. He broke off an end of a comb in his hair and set it on fire for light. When he found her, he was shocked to find that his once beautiful wife was now a rotting corpse. She was being consumed by maggots. Izanami was furious that he didn't listen to her, and she was ashamed to be seen in this condition, so she chased Izanagi out of the underworld and bore more deities, the deities of thunder, and sent them after him. She chased him as well. When he got out, he moved an enormous rock to block her passage so that she couldn't get out. When Izanagi returned home, he bathed himself to remove himself of all the uncleanliness of the underworld. And as he did so, he followed a purification ceremony by the river. As he stripped off his clothes, more deities were born from his clothing and his robes, and as he washed, more deities were born from that process as well. And the last part of this ceremony, he washed his right eye, his left eye, and his nose. From his right eye, Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, was born. From his left eye, Susanoo was born, god of the sea and storms. And from his nose, Tsukuyomi was born, god of the moon. The emperors that go on to rule Japan will be descendants of the goddess Amaterasu. So, why is this story so important? Well, a number of reasons. It will explain the importance of their customs and their traditions. These customs and traditions are going to be the same customs and traditions that are going to ultimately lead them to a feudal period. It's going to be these same customs and traditions that help to explain the importance of the emperor because of where he stands in their creation history. It explains the existence of deities, these kami and these spirits that are going to be in everything to do with nature in the Shinto religion that originates in Japan. It is so tied with Japanese culture in general. And it also helps to explain that the early Japanese, much like many other cultures we looked at, had this sense of being favored with the heavens.